This is the final segment of our lecture on Period 3, New Imperialism in the non-Western world. We have finished talking about the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the decline of the Qing dynasty in China due to a lack of modernization and industrialization. But we're going to see something different happen in Japan, where Japan is going to rapidly industrialize due to them seeing the writing on the wall of what happens to unindustrialized nations in light of the rise of power of the European states. So prior to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, Japan had intentionally isolated itself. It isolated itself under the Tokugawa Shogunate from 1600 to 1854 in order to preserve their traditional values and their culture. So they purposely isolated themselves and cut themselves off from the rest of the world to cut off any foreign intervention. So they did allow for some regional lords to trade with China due to the fact that China had once been the Middle Kingdom and Japan had actively adopted sinification in order to copy the rise of power in the golden age of the Tang and the Song. However, once we get to 1853, when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry, quote unquote, opens up Japan with gunboat diplomacy, that is when we're going to see Japan quickly start to modernize using European technology, because they realize that they need to either modernize or be colonized. Because they see what's happening to China. For instance, with the Opium Wars, the once mighty Middle Kingdom had gone up against Britain, and Britain's industrial might and their head start from the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to a staggering and humiliating loss in the Opium War for China. So they don't want what's happening in China to happen to Japan. So whereas in period 2, they actively copied Chinese culture through the process of sinification, they're going to do the opposite here in period 3. Instead, they're going to mimic what's going on in Europe. So they're going to, in Japan, they are going to strengthen their central government, become more centralized. They're going to very rapidly industrialize faster than anyone else in this time period, eventually allowing them to defeat a industrialized European power like Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And they do this by adopting culture and technology from the West. So much like they adopted Chinese culture through sinification in period 2, they are going to do the same thing here in period 3 with Western culture, especially when it comes to technology. This video is available on Schoology if you'd like to watch it as additional resources. So back to the context, the history of isolationism in Japan. That started under the Tokugawa Shogunate after there was conflict with foreigners in Japan. And so the practice of Christianity had been banned from Japan, and then foreign influences in the form of books as well as religions was also banned. But they are going to continue to trade with other Eastern Asian territories. So the Tokugawa Shogunate is known for its isolationism that preserves traditional Japanese culture, such as the Bushido Code of chivalry, followed by the samurai who are outfitted with gunpowder weapons like muskets. However, that is not going to be equivalent to what the Europeans and the United States are going to bring to Japan. Whereas the samurai have swords and old muskets from the Portuguese back in period 2, the gunboat diplomacy done by the West is going to include gunboats with Maxim guns and more advanced technology due to the spread of industrialization. And so this contact with the West is going to end the Tokugawa period of isolationism. In 1853, Matthew Perry essentially bullies Japan into trade concessions, into opening up trade with Western powers. Okay, this type of diplomacy of encouraging economic exchange through threat of domination is known as gunboat diplomacy. Essentially, you show up with a bunch of gunboats and say, hey, you can either trade with us now or you can trade with us later once we use a show of force to show you that we mean business. So Japan is going to respond to this by opening itself up to Western technology because it doesn't want what happened to China happening to them, like with the Opium Wars. They're going to try to avoid conflict with Europeans at first. Japan is going to rise to an imperial power, and they are going to defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War. But it's not until the 1900s, in 1904, that we see them square up against a European force and, against all odds, actually defeat that European force. This is the first time that an Asian nation had been able to defeat a industrialized European power. So that is going to be very historically significant. But for the most part, they're going to try to avoid conflict with the Europeans by opening up for trade with the Europeans, but also rapidly industrializing so that they can compete with these European powers. Now, like China and like the Ottoman Empire, Japan is going to allow extraterritoriality to foreigners, so they are going to make some economic concessions there. And just like with the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty, these laws, this extraterritoriality, is going to result in anti-foreigner sentiment. Okay, so we saw that there's anti-foreigner sentiment against the Europeans in China with the Boxer Rebellion, and we're going to see that same sort of sentiment grow here due to that European intervention. But the political conflict that's going to emerge is actually going to lead to a change in the government in Japan. So we see the collapse of the shogunate, which, remember, had been established since the 12th century, when the most powerful daimyo with the biggest military forces were able to rise to power using their samurai armies and then establish themselves as the real head of state, the shogun, while they kept the emperor on as a figurehead. So back in period 2, if you wanted to take over Japan, you wouldn't target the emperor. The emperor was just a figurehead. Real power was held by the shogun. And the longest lasting shogunate in Japan at that time had been the Tokugawa Shogunate that had originally set that period of isolationism. Well, now that that isolationism is over, we start seeing conflict between the foreign Europeans and the native Japanese. And that increased anti-foreigner sentiment and conflict and change is going to undermine the absolute power of the shogun. So eventually we see the collapse of the shogunate and the rise of the emperor. So this is going to be a restoration of this form of government where the emperor isn't just a figurehead. Now the emperor is the actual ruler of the government and the country. Okay, so this contact with the West is going to make the shogunate unpopular due to the concessions and the capitulations that are made by Japan. And so we see a change in government with the Meiji restoration. Mutsuhito is going to be restored to the throne as the Japanese emperor, thus starting the Meiji era, which continues all the way until World War I in 1912. Okay, so we see a similarity there between the Meiji Japan and the Ottoman Empire. In terms of change that's going to be implemented as a result of the Meiji restoration, we do see some reforms by the Meiji state being implemented. Due to the spread of Enlightenment ideals, we see a move away from the old ways of feudalism, where you have decentralization of a country. Now they want to move towards a more centralized state, centralized under the power of the shogun. And with this abolishment of feudalism, we are going to see a core part of feudalism, an armed force that works for the nobility, become abolished as well. So we will eventually see the end of the samurai class in Japan due to this charter oath in 1868. We're also going to see the establishment of courts, judicial reforms, changing the legal system. The feudalism is going to decrease, with the Hans being reorganized into prefectures. These are going to be districts that are run by the government, centralized under the emperor, rather than being ruled by local nobles. So we see a decrease in the decentralization and an increase in centralized rule. We also see that this empire becomes a constitutional monarchy. So there are going to be limits or shared power on the emperor. It's not just he is an absolute ruler. He is going to have to be held accountable to his actions and to the people. The military is going to be remodeled as a part of the reform, just like in the Ottoman Empire. A postal service is going to be established that helps with helps with communication. Then we see a new education system, again focusing more on the secular. But most importantly, the reforms that are implemented by the Meiji state that help Japan resist colonization is going to be the promotion of rapid industrialization. That is what's going to make them different than the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire, because the Ottoman Empire and Chinese Empire were slower to reform compared to the Japanese. Now, just like with the resistance to the 100 Days of Reform and the self-strengthening movement and the resistance to the Tanzimat reforms, we are going to see some traditionalists want to stay with the way things are rather than make all of these changes. So with the abolishment of feudalism, the group that's going to be opposed to these reforms is going to be the samurai class, because the samurai had been a part of that feudalistic system. They had a certain code, the Bushido code. They were taken care of on the manners, and they were highly respected, similar to what we saw with the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. But the samurai, like the Janissaries, represent a threat to the power of the government, because if some noble or some rebel gets a large enough number of these samurai to side with them, that is a threat to the government's solvency. So in 1871, the emperor, the Meiji emperor, is going to pay off the samurai, give them money, and dissolve their position. They're going to take up the arms that the samurai had, so the samurai have to turn over their weaponry to the government, and they're no longer going to be samurai. So these ronin, or unemployed samurai, some of them join the bureaucracy and become genros. Okay, they become elder bureaucrats working for the government as opposed to against it. But there are going to be some holdouts that want to maintain their traditional culture. They are going to resist, just like we saw the Janissaries resisting in the Ottoman Empire when their position was dissolved. But just like with the Janissaries, the samurai are going to be unsuccessful in maintaining their way of life in the face of reform because of rapid industrialization. Times have changed. They become more modern. And this industrialization and modernization is going to create new jobs that require more workers, trained workers. But these are going to be workers that are unskilled and therefore cheaper. So the Meiji Empire, the government, is going to want citizens who are educated, capable, obedient, and loyal. So they want people, their citizenship, to be smart enough to know what to do and to make good decisions, also be competent enough to carry the country forward, but also be patriotic and obedient to the emperor and their nation. So governments are going to pay schools. They're going to give them money to train workers in specific skills and fields specific to industrialization and modernization. Okay, those schools become technical schools. Okay, training them in particular fields as artisans or as workers in the industry, okay, electricians or mechanical school. And then you also see the implementation of universal education. So education is not just something for the rich people or the people with means. Now universal education is implemented, which allows all of Japan to have access to education. Okay, so this falls into that desire of wanting citizens who are educated. Okay, so rising everybody up to that level of education benefits the country as a whole. They're also going to modernize their transportation with the implementation of railroads. Communication systems are going to be helped with railroads, as well as the invention of the telegraph. And you start seeing the rapid industrialization of Japan is made possible by the fact that the government and private industry work together for that purpose. They work together towards the same goal of rapidly industrializing so that they don't become colonized. So a partnership between the government, the Meiji dynasty, and private investors in Japan that have capital. Now, one such example of this increased industrialization that is kind of relevant to today is the creation of the Toyota Loom Works. You may remember that the British Empire, when they started industrializing in the first industrial revolution, their focus was on textiles. Well, with Japan, it's the same. The Toyota Loom Works is going to be dealing with manufacturing clothing. Eventually, over time, as we get to the second industrial revolution and we move more towards chemicals and electricity and steel, we see a change from Toyota Loom Works to Toyota Motor Company. Okay, with the improvement and modernization of transportation. So that is a company that is still making cars to this day. So we do see a pretty drastic change over time from isolationism to imperialism, becoming a strong imperial nation, invading other countries. Okay, so they are going to follow the pattern of the Europeans in these steps. They essentially follow Britain and what they do. First, they industrialize. First, they move into textiles. Then they start expanding their military advantages with this technology. And they start building their empire, like with the scramble for Africa. And so Japan wants to do the same. They want to be more like the Europeans. The Europeans are scrambling to grab up as much territory as they can to provide raw materials for their factories. And so Japan is going to do the same thing. Okay, they are going to seek more territory as a result of industrialization, because that's how industrialization works, is that if you're going to manufacture goods to make a profit, you're going to need raw materials. Can't make a lot of clothing if you don't have a lot of cotton. So the Europeans are going to colonize, like the British colonize India in order to have abundant resource of cotton. And so Japan is going to do the same thing, because with its status as an island, it will eventually run out of land and natural resources. So this leads to Japanese colonization under new imperialism, just like with the Europeans. They are going to establish a colonization society where they try to move into different territories in the Pacific, for instance, to try and increase Japanese influence there. We also see the growth of, once again, nationalism. Now, you may remember nationalism as being an extreme form of patriotism that you may want to keep a close eye on, because if you believe that your country is the best or your culture is the best, then by definition, that means that you think others are inferior, with the most illustrative example of a nationalist party being the Nazi Party of Germany. Well, we do see Japan going down that road as well, because in World War II, the Germans, the German Nazis, and Japan are going to ally together, thus leading, just like we saw with the genocide of the Jewish population and others in Germany in World War II and across Europe, we are going to see a similar genocide committed by the Japanese against the Chinese. Okay, so that nationalism can be a slippery slope towards some pretty negative events in history, to say the least. But in following the patterns of the Europeans, Japan is going to centralize its government by getting rid of feudalism, abolishing the samurai, and centralizing their power under a constitutional monarchy. So they centralize the government, neutralize the samurai, and they modernize their military by making it based on conscription, which means every citizen has to serve for a specified period of time, which is going to bolster their army. And more people means more power. We also see that as the Japanese move into imperialism, their first target is going to be their former state that they paid tribute to. So Japan used to be a tributary state of China back in period 2 under the Tang and the Song with the Middle Kingdom, but that changes now. Now China is no longer the top power in East Asia, and we see this illustrated with the Japanese victory in the Sino-Japanese War. So as a result of this loss, China is going to lose territory. It loses Taiwan and it loses the Liaodong Peninsula. So Japan is rising as an imperial power, taking more territory and thus accessing more resources. However, as a result of this interference, Russia is going to intervene and say, hey, Japan, you can't take this peninsula from China. Now remember, the Europeans hadn't colonized China, but they had carved out spheres of influence in terms of their economic interests and investments. So they're very willing to protect their economic interests in China. And so Russia is going to intervene in this treaty and say, hey, you need to give this peninsula back to China. However, this is going to be reversed once we get to the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, this is the first victory of an Asian nation over Europeans in the modern era, which is particularly important considering that Russia had also been industrializing. So in 1905, Japan is going to win in this war, and they are going to come for revenge in their negotiated treaty, in the Treaty of Portsmouth. This peninsula that the Russians had made Japan give back to China after the Sino-Japanese War is going to be returned to Japan. They're going to take Russian territory that the Russians had established in Manchuria, and so that means Chinese power is decreasing and Russian power is decreasing as Japan gains that power. They're also going to take another tributary state of China when they establish a protectorate in Korea. Okay, so what are the long-term effects of this? Well, Japan is going to increase in prestige and clout on the world stage, and Russia is going to go through a series of hardships and ills that eventually leads to its decline. So we see the Russian Revolution of 1905 definitely playing a factor in the change in Russian government. The failure of the Russian Navy to succeed in this war against the Japanese, the loss of the war leading to economic burdens that mostly fall on the Russian people, i.e. the increase in taxes. None of that is going to make the Russian government very popular, just like what we saw with the loss of the Opium Wars in the Qing dynasty, where that led to the Taiping Rebellion. So as we move out of period 3 and into period 4, we note the impacts of industrialization as it relates to imperialism, but also the impacts of industrialization as it leads to the rise of some nations and the decline of others, mainly the Ottoman, the Chinese, and the rise of the Japanese Empire in light of industrialization and modernization as Europeans begin culturally diffusing and imperializing in the modern age.